let's start off by accepting that some of the things that happened in post-Soviet states have been terrible. That Russia essentially colonized these places, moved populations into them, and treated them very badly. But the question in this debate isn't about whether all of that happened. Everyone accepts it did. The question is it better for the local Russian people who live in these countries, who are treated in a very undignified and uncivil way, if they are included? And will it make better relations with Russia and better domestic politics if these countries abandon these narratives? And we think the answer to both of those questions is yes, and I'll talk to both. What do we support? We support these countries embracing a shared history of their Russian heritage and their former colonial position. We say that's true of a lot of countries that have been colonized around the world by countries like Britain. But we think that just like those countries that have been colonized in the past, they should strive towards a strong relationship with Russia. We think that we won't have holidays anymore that are pro-independence, like really pro or celebrate the end of Russian rule. But we think that it's fine in some ways to commemorate and come together around certain events in the past. And we say that good examples of that are things like the Holocaust. We accept that, obviously that happened. That's something that is acknowledged in German history, but isn't blameworthy, and there's eroding resentment over time. We think this is a judgment debate. The question is whether past dominance of Russia should form a part of the national heritage, and we say that these countries should abandon that. So first I want to talk about domestic politics. Yeah.
So, are you advocating for a general pro-Russian and closer to Russian policy for countries like the Ukraine, or are you just discussing the narrative shift that the motion implies? Which one is it? Both are fine.
So we think that these countries should abandon that narrative, and as a result will form more normalized relations with Russia, which I'll explain in my second point. So, domestic politics will be less corrosive. We think a large part of these populations are Russian. Look at Lithuania and Estonia. We've got 3 points to make here. First, we think automatically these countries should just give these people rights as part of this process. So if you look in Estonia, right, there's a massive Russian population which aren't allowed Estonian passports, even though they may have been there for 5 generations. We think that's extremely problematic from just like a common sense rights standpoint, just exclude part of your population from being able to vote and civically engage. We think that's disgusting, something these countries do, and we'll end it tomorrow. But on a deeper level, we think, in a second way, this isolates the Russian communities from the aggression they have towards the local polity. Because the existence of historical narratives mean that these people often demonize these Russian populations in the country. And that's true because of the unsophisticated historical narratives that existed when these countries became independent. Largely demagogues who are really anti-Russia and really pro-nationalism took power in these countries. And as a result, they blame the local people, right? They encouraged Estonians to hate Russian Estonians, which led to these people feeling incredibly isolated. It makes them feel like they're not sure whether they're Russian or Estonian. It means that they keep their own languages. They go to their own schools that are segregated because they get the type of discrimination in everyday life because they are Russian. And what that means is that they, A, don't integrate to the local culture, feel constantly on the cusp, form their own communities, form their own businesses, which is just terrible time bomb waiting to happen. But secondly, they form pro-Russian parties. We think there's an incentive to start a counter-narrative if you are one of these oppressed minorities that are Russian-speaking in these countries. And they do things like elect really unsophisticated leaders in order to respond to the unsophisticated demagogue national leaders, say, in Estonia, or in a better example, maybe the Ukraine, right? And those people do the most terrible thing, right? They blame the local populace. They say they're racially superior for being Russian. The long-term result of that is 2 peoples in one country that never come together, that are constantly fighting a war of worlds, and end up fighting with bullets, right? That is what has happened in Ukraine, as high levels of Russian-speaking ethnic Russians exist in different locations that are separate, start their own parties, feel isolated. They lead to the kind of political infighting, the denial of rights, and real fighting, which loses lives. Secondly, let's talk about relations with Russia. I'll take one.
So when you talk about shared history, when you talk about history, presumably mean battles and things that happened in the past, against whom and which countries do you think they should celebrate battles against?
Okay, so a good example of this, right, is some people in this room would be Europeans, right? Europeans would colonize each other, destroy each other for years and years, force religions upon each other. Today they're in the EU. That happened because they accepted that they wanted a shared European experience. That didn't happen because they held on to the resentment for a very long time. We think that that's what we are advocating for. So relations with Russia. We want in this debate an apology from Russia, and we also want increased trade. We think we get that through our side of the house. First, we remove Russian antagonism. Putin has an incentive to meddle in Ukraine where he feels under threat, where there's a narrative of hate towards Russians that plays out very toxically in Russian politics and incentivizes Russian leaders to take action in places like Crimea. That was his primary justification. We say that when the national narrative is less about the hate for Russia, that stops Putin from being able to point to those things and use them as a justification, use them as justification for protecting Russian-speaking people, which is exactly the phrase he used in the media. Second, we think it leads to a more nuanced IR response to Russia. Because when you have a narrative that is predominantly hate towards Russia or like antagonism towards Russia, we think it only allows you to have one response to Russia, right? And your response is always antagonistic, always fearful, always threatening. Which means you can never do anything positive with Russia. You can't, when Russia does something badly, act angrily, and when Russia does something you like, act nice. Because if you do that, right, you're perceived as being weak in your domestic politics. We think that leads to a lot of antagonism with Russia, which means it stops trade, it stops types of bilateral agreements with Russia that would lead to these people eventually forming a kind of European bloc like we see in the EU, and that is bad and it stops long-term progression between those places. Third, we think it allows these nations to obtain foreign support. We think that Western diplomats and countries are more likely to be favourable to a country that is able to take a soft and hard line to Russia, depending on what Russia does, rather than the internal politics always driving them to the most hardcore outcome. We think that means that they're more likely to support them when Russia does bad things. But we also think the US is likely to interfere less in domestic politics. Because when these countries are constantly starting feuds with Russia, and Russia's interfering and starts to interfere in their elections, the US feels it has to do the same thing. We think that when these countries are less dispassionate, less angry about Russia, and Russia doesn't react by trying to control their politics, the US will do the same thing, and these countries will be more independent overall. Finally, let's talk about long-term engagement. We think that when these countries accept that they had a history, but don't celebrate or define themselves entirely against that history, it means they're more likely to make bilateral agreements with each other and Russia, and over time form a type of polity that is more likely to be close economically and politically like the EU. We think that doesn't happen unless you move on from the past. We're proud to close.
Thank you very much. Each like to call on the third speaker for the opposition.
It is not just a divide between Russians and non-Russians that plagues these nations. If you look at the divides between Wahhabi and Sufi Muslims in the Caucasus regions, for example, it's just trivially not true that the only thing we need to care about in terms of protecting minorities is the predominantly richest and safest group that openly government want to talk about. I want to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, I want to talk about how narratives of overthrowing communism and the USSR are unifying. Secondly, I want to talk about how they're value neutral and why that's important. Before that, some points of refutation. So the claim here we get is that in domestic politics there's a particular need to protect the Russian population. A couple of things here to know. Firstly, by virtue of the fact that they are ethnically Russian, they are much more likely to be treated better by the USSR and thus less likely to succumb to things like poverty that mean that they are likely to be particularly influenced by these kinds of things. So if we manage to prove to you that there's a comparative between disenchanting them and disenchanting other groups by virtue of selecting some kind of nationalism or some kind of prescriptive version of national culture, then we would prefer not to do that. Secondly, inasmuch as the Russian population themselves were on net also harmed by communism, no thank you. Fail to see why necessarily the kind of prescriptive national fabric that we want to create has to be one that oppresses Russians. A large number of Russians themselves believe that the Soviet Union was bad for Ukrainians, but also was bad for them. So it's actually possible to have a version of national culture that includes ethnic Russians as well, because they too are subject to the horrible living conditions that exist in that time. No, thank you. Secondly, I just want to point out that if we look at the comparative between Ukraine and kind of conflict that we saw in Serbia, I'm not convinced that Ukraine is literally the worst example that's possible to conceive of, and that civil wars are possible and indeed have plagued, Chechnya and Dagestan in the past. So it's not clear this is the only, empirically the only thing we care about. Secondly, on Russian antagonism in particular. Two claims here. The first of which is that we actually think that engendering cooperation between Eastern European nations is particularly helpful. The reason is no thank you. As I'm going to try and establish later, the alternative kinds of national culture we want to establish are likely to be divisive, by which fact that history, in almost all circumstances in the past, does not consist of cooperative ventures and things like a free trade deal that allowed everyone to move past. In their choice of selected history, What they mean is instead of objecting to Russian imperialism, they will object to other ethnic minorities within the region and talk about battles between neighbouring countries or between neighbouring ethnic groups. So we think that actually that harms their capacity to cooperate together. Second, we think that actually cooperation is necessary because individual nations are particularly weak in this instance. Like there's a collective action problem that precludes them from doing things like establishing large standing armies that means countries like Estonia are particularly vulnerable. Secondly, I just want to point out that Russian nationalism probably will continue to threaten these countries and is to a large extent the cause of the conflict in this region. The reason that countries are at risk, and the reason that countries like Chechnya are invaded and Estonia are at risk, is that Russian-speaking people, and not just ethnically Russian people, are considered part of Russia. The view in Russia is that Ukraine, the loss of Ukraine, is a tragedy, and the loss of Kiev was an appalling act that desecrates the fabric of the Russian nation. That is the cause of continuing antagonism in the region. Further, if you look at the conflicts that have been initiated, they've followed times of relatively low economic growth and the need to improve popularity for Russian leaders in the past. So things like the war in Chechnya followed Yeltsin's corruption scandal. So for those reasons, we don't think it's likely to end. And if they claim anything, it's incredibly non-comparative. Given we get some sort of unification against the threat, we win on that. No, thank you. Why is this unifying? Just note that there are ethnically homogenous groups in this region, and it's actually relatively likely that divides will form along this line if they don't occur in some sort of unified manner against Russia. Why is that the case? Because in the past, the conflicts they've talked about, the fact that they're divided, the fact they're different states, the fact they were treated differently by the Russians, and selective prioritization of groups was used as a way to control local populations, means that people's identity falls along these lines relatively naturally, which means that things like political parties, things like organisation likely fall along the lines. So there is the risk within these nations where the ability to influence outcomes of people's lives is significantly greater. If you could ask with a slightly greater interval, I'd like that. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we think that that actually there's a much greater risk within nations of things like oppression taking place. So the problem is when you choose these histories, we argue they are likely to be selective. Things like geography mean that people who live within certain groups are prioritised by virtue of that. Things like history mean that the oppressor at a given point of time is celebrated as the thing the nation upholds, which means that minority groups within nations are treated poorly, which means that neighbouring states are treated poorly. That's when you have a very real risk of inter-conflict within those nations. Why is this better under our certain house? The thing about oppression of Russia is that it's unifying. It's much like a homogeneously poor experience of life under Russian rule. So even if not everyone contributed towards that narrative, it contributed towards the revolution, it's nonetheless true that almost everybody benefited from it by virtue of the awful state of communism under the USSR. So we think that actually, on net, things are better. I've tried to point out why we can include Russians and why, if not, it's still not that problematic. Secondly, why is this in general a better form why is it in general a better form of national fabric? Because we claim that the other forms of national identity that you would choose are prescriptive. What is true about revolution? Firstly, revolution is continuous. Revolution is justified with respect to overthrowing things like poverty, corruption, and oppression. This creates an imperative for people who want to claim themselves to be nationalists, upholding the fabric of the state, to consistently act in line with those principles, to consistently overthrow imperialism, both domestic and otherwise, to overthrow the corruption and the poverty that was played by the USSR. Secondly, it's value neutral. Note that when you commit yourself to revolution, essentially what you are doing is you're saying we end this current state of government. It doesn't prescribe the view of what life should be in the future, which means that there can be competition as to who owns a national and political narrative. That means that none of these demagogues that exist otherwise can be the claim that they are the sole protector of revolution because they can justify the fact that they represent revolution and that what they want to replace revolution with is better. What is the comparison under their side of the house? When you allow the leaders at this given point in time to essentially selectively choose what they want to take place, they think they are likely to choose identities that allow them to claim that they are intrinsically right. They can be prescriptive. So if you choose things like given the success of a given racial group, for example, that allows people to claim that they are the defender of that racial group, and therefore or they align themselves to a particular point in the past, and therefore they intrinsically represent the nationalism of that country. If you allow them to choose geographic regions, it allows them, the defenders of that region, to claim that they act in the national interest and that what they stand for is indeed nationalism. So the problem here is that you give political parties and political regions incredible power to oppress each other, to oppress minority groups in the region, and to define what constitutes a state. That is when we think that you get backslide into dictatorial regimes, where people no longer have to justify themselves simply because they were the revolution. They can control the version of nationalism, at least when we have a value-neutral version of national fabric. People can be held accountable. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for the speech. I'd like to call up the second speaker for the country.
You see two shared experiences for post-colonial societies. You see those that hold on to the grievances of the past as a way to motivate their domestic politics and to try and bind themselves together with hatred for an external enemy or a perceived enemy within your borders. We see the post-colonial societies that are able to recognise that living together with the former oppressors and having to have relationships with their former oppressor is going to be a part of their reality for the rest of their history. And the only way to move to ensure that that is a positive relationship is to build a positive, inclusive, forward-looking national identity that says, yes, terrible things happen, we should have truth and reconciliation, we should tell our histories, but we should also recognise that we're bound together by that shared experience, by a shared literature, by a shared culture and identity, and that we should embark together on the project of building a community together that reaches out to our former oppressors and makes the world a better place. And that's a narrative you've seen played out to varying degrees of success in Britain's former colonies to an extent. And we think that's what this debate comes down to, right? Is it better to go for the short-term benefit of otherising and emphasising the enemy, or is it to simply acknowledge that you can recognise the wrongdoing that's had, but not make the narratives about blood? And that plays out in terms of commemorating collective loss of both Russians and your ethnic group in the conflicts, rather than emphasising only your losses. It's about not harping on about your great victories. It's not about erecting nationalist monuments about to the time you burned down a village of evil Russian oppression. It's not about having your history designed in a way that emphasises difference. Those are the levers that get pulled if you adopt our principle, and they're ones that I continue to be proud to stand by. My speech is relatively straightforward. I'm going to extend about the harms of an ethno-nationalist identity more generally and how toxic and corrosive it is to civil institutions. But before that, let's deal with some rebuttal about what we heard come out of the Leader of the Opposition. The first thing they noted is that there are other divides within these countries and that there is potentially a trade-off in this debate. We would say that an inclusive national identity built on a deliberate approach of including different parties is also likely to include all those other minorities as well. But the notable thing is that if you embark on a project of otherising one group, you then basically set the narrative, which is that politics is zero-sum and every group needs to look out for themselves, which is when you get the bleed over into the further types of toxicity towards ethnic or religious minorities that group is that side of the house is so worried about. The second point was to try and dismiss our entire analysis, which they didn't actually reject the mechanisms of, about how ethnic Russians in these countries will be systematically abused as we see play out empirically, because they're likely to be rich. We would point out that they're actually more likely to be targeted for either civil or property destruction and for asset seizure and loss of their rights and stuff, so we think that any historical advantage they've had is quickly eroding. They're less likely to get civil service jobs or be entitled to be able to access the professions through university and college educations, and often those people are forced migrants who weren't particularly rich when they arrived in these countries because they were sent there as a political move by these Russian states. And often these are a benighted, enclave, socially and economically isolated minority who, yes, might have had some social capital, but we don't think having a rich vein of social capital is a legitimation of why you should oppress those people, right? We would actually think you should be embracing them into your society because they probably have quite a bit to offer. The next thing they talked about was that basically the thrust of their case was that they had an alternative proposal to ours, which is to create a unifying ethno-nationalist identity that would allow these countries to unify themselves internally and across borders by basically positioning themselves in antagonism to Russia. We gave you screeds of analysis in Josh's speech about how that antagonistic perspective vis-a-vis Russia is hugely corrosive both on their domestic politics but also on their relationships with Russia, right? Because it provides a justification for bellicose Russian political actors to justify aggression against those countries on the basis of protecting ethnic Russian minorities, which has really high valence and play with Russian trendsetters and intellectuals and also gives Vladimir Putin some great campaign slogans. We also pointed out that it creates a toxic scenario where the domestic politics is very high stakes, very existential, very nihilistic, and overreacts, it doesn't use the levers of soft and hard power in a responsible way, becomes very much about campaigning on who can be tougher with Russia and who can be tougher on the locals, and that toxifies it over time and makes it less and less space for there to be reproachful on over time. I also pointed out in my introduction that you can perfectly reasonably build a strong and unifying narrative around your shared cultural experiences, your shared contributions to the national project of improvement, your shared language, or lack of difference of language, and embrace linguistic diversity and the cognitive benefits that brings for child development. Countries all over the world have been able to build national identities that are strong, but also open and inclusive of other nations. We gave you the example of Western Europe. We don't have France and Germany every year having big celebrations about the fact that France won the Second World War and gave the Germans a kicking, right? What they said is that a horrific mutual tragedy occurred and that we should unify together in our shared experience of that tragedy and use it as a motivation to put aside historical grievances and embark on a major project of Eurasian, in this case, restoration. Yes.
I'd hate to ruin TopTap's fun with the facts, but Poland and Hungary and Estonia are members of the EU, which is sanctioning Russia. Ukraine and Georgia are at war with Russia, and half of those countries don't even have a Russian minority. So why would any of your case happen?
So what's the solution, right, on your side of the house? Because it's to double down on ethno-nationalism in the sense that there's an adversarial zero-sum game. We gave you lots of mechanisms to explain that that narrative was exactly what triggered those conditions, right? What you want, presumably, is a piece of coexistence and mutual understanding across the Eurasian region. That is a long-term project that will take a lot of time. But to achieve that process, you need to detoxify their domestic politics and allow them to respond reasonably, and you need to detoxify Russian politics and allow them to respond reasonably. Yes, you might need to use hard power occasionally to support countries like Ukraine, but we gave you a mechanism that said that that hard power was more likely to be used when US domestic politics didn't consider Poland and Ukraine to be dodgy states that had a whole bunch of ethno-nationalist uproar, right? If we can more clearly see that they are approaching this from the right position and acting as good, positive players, we are more able to support them reasonably in exercising hard power, which obviously reduces Russia's capacity to exercise hard power itself. So no, that wasn't a fist bump POI. Ethno-nationalism. I just want to extend briefly on the ethno-nationalism point, because I think it's critical to this debate. So the thing to note here is that when you have narratives that are entirely about otherizing other groups and having enemies within your borders, or enemies across the border who are trying to infiltrate with little green men or economically sanctioned things, that creates a sense that politics is zero-sum and that the ends justify the means. That's what creates the environment where creeping autocracy like surveillance, control, diminishment of political and judicial rights, like we saw in Poland where the rights of the judiciary was reduced in reaction to concerns that they were being suborned by pro-Russian parties, right? You create a lowering of social trust, which breaks down civil society and the institutions of civil society like an independent judiciary and an independent press, which are necessary to normalise people's conceptions of their identity and how it relates to others. So ethno-nationalism directly targets that by saying that politics is groups, because if you're ethno-nationalist, right, you can't change your nationality, so it has to be zero-sum because there's no potential for rapprochement and potential for cooperation. That's unique to that side of the house and it's something that we reject. Very proud to suppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Just call on the second speaker for the opposition.
I'd just like to note very briefly that identity that celebrates this, or recognizes at least, this independent struggle can also include Russians for two reasons. Firstly, that ethnic Russians had an awful time under the Soviet Union. And secondly, that people who did well generally under the Soviet Union tended to be people who were brought in from Moscow or St. Petersburg, brought in as Russian administrators and therefore weren't in the long-term part of that area. So we think that we can still have an inclusive national identity under these grounds. Three things. Firstly, a brief note on ethnic and religious conflict. Secondly, talking about Russian imperialism. Thirdly, talking about why this narrative still exists, but rather, instead of being controlled by the government, starts being controlled by other actors in much worse ways. On ethnic and religious conflict. Their claim of them having culture instead is insufficient. Firstly, this assumes that there exists a unified culture in these countries, which often is not the case, whereas the struggle against Russian imperialism was often a struggle against communism as well, and therefore it was a unified struggle. It was a struggle undergone by everyone who had suffered from its effects. But secondly, and more important, the low-level history of ethno-nationalist conflict, ethnic conflict, is much worse. Because Russian imperialism is a history of oppression by the Soviet Union as an actor, versus things like the conflict over Islam or the conflict in the Balkans, which were a conflict that affected people within individual villages on a person-to-person level, and therefore an identity that's based around some other cultural aspect will be an identity that is a much more localized and therefore much more damaging form of identity. Okay, on Russian imperialism now, we have three major advantages. Firstly, our objection is to Russian imperialism, not to Russia itself. So the narrative of Russian imperialism as objection to Russians as individuals is something that we can take away using the government as, when the government objects to the Soviet Union in general. Secondly, Greg told you that unity versus ethnic conflict is very, very important. Because Russia can see if there exists ethnic conflict as a reason to intervene within these countries, as indeed happened with Chechnya. Thirdly, it gives the ability for us to actually protect against Russia in terms of stopping war. This is because when we actually object to Russian imperialism is exactly the thing that we are seeing happening right now, which means that it's much easier for us as part of this country to object to the pro-Russian parties saying, oh, we should actually give in to Russia, we should actually help Russia more, when our national identity is based around an aspect that says that Russian imperialism was a bad thing and it's something that we have to object to. Which means that it's much easier to defend against Russian advances within the long term. I'll take a POI from closing.
Okay, here's the problem with this argumentation. It's unclear that all states should be anti-Russia, but for all the states that should be anti-Russia, I'm not sure this marginal identity change will be more important than the pressing war that's out of their borders, which will likely motivate them to do the exact same actions without their harms.
Okay, so the problem with the pressing war that's on their borders is that not everyone within these countries thinks that the war is bad, because there is a certain strain of people that think that the Soviet Union was actually fine, or that think, for instance, in Russia, in Ukraine, that Russia could actually be a good thing for Ukraine. If we have a national identity that says that this unambiguously was bad, it becomes much easier for us to object to it on those grounds and therefore try and get against it. Why the narrative still exists. So opening government says that they will remove things like, I don't know, national ceremonies, etc. And their problem is with anti-Russian demagogues. Anti-Russian demagogues will probably stay in power for three reasons. Firstly, because the struggle was relatively recent, which means that a lot of people still know people who fought in the conflict. There are lots of people, these people who fought against Russia who are still alive, and also people at the very least will have heard from their parents and grandparents about the struggle and about the oppression at that time. Secondly, because revolutionary elites were likely to be people that were still in power, and thirdly, because the narrative of conflict has been up to this point perpetrated, but at least the narrative of conflict against Russia was perpetrated at that point. Why is this much worse? A few reasons. Firstly, because currently when we do it with the government, it's moderated. It's moderated because the government has a political incentive not to totally piss off Russia, whereas smaller ethnic parties will not have that incentive. So the government will likely propagate a more moderate version of this than they would ethnically. Second, also, this government has a political incentive to appeal to the whole country rather than just individual regions. But if you have a very individual region that suffered very heavily under the Soviet Union, people within that region would have a massive incentive to play out with this culture of nationalism, and therefore say decrease relations with Russia even further. Secondly, because it moderates because of the reactions of moderates. The reactions of moderates are doing things like not commemorating the struggle that possibly lots of people that they knew or their parents would have died in, is likely to be very, very, very aggressive. It means that instead of moderates, the bar for moderates being anti-Russia being, or anti-government being that you've decided that maybe we shouldn't be so awful towards Russia, the bar then becomes only that you think that we should commemorate the struggle against revolution, which is a much lower bar against moderates. Thirdly, because you can look at the more, because there's more likely the ethnic conflict, because we can look at the general picture of the Soviet Union rather than the picture of localized and low-level conflict. It's interesting that in Greg's POI, when he asked about what else, their response is Europe. Europe currently does commemorate things like the Second World War, definitely does commemorate things like the First World War, and I think the reaction to it would be very, very extreme outrage if Europe did not commemorate these sorts of things, because it becomes something about wanting to help your parents or your grandparents be remembered, or wanting to know about this conflict, rather than something about, I don't know, wanting to destroy Russia or thinking that Russia is a horrible influence on the international stage. This means that most of opening government's benefits about like how well I'll take you 5 seconds, about how well we can have relations with Russia, about domestic politics, does not accrue under their side of the house as much as under our side. Yes.
So your characterization of these leaders is that you agree that they're often anti-Russian demagogues. So are those people really likely to use the exact right amount of nationalist identity to get the benefits you pointed to, but not overstep the line and get our harms that we've talked about?
No, my characterization of other people in this country is that I think that in these countries there exists anti-Russian demagogues, enough to object to saying that the national liberation struggle is not something that is actually good, or not something that you should actually commemorate. which means that actually I think the reaction will be very extreme. I think that political leaders do have incentives to be relatively moderate, as opposed to, for instance, far-right newspapers or very, very anti-Russian delegates. What are the impacts of this? Well, firstly, instead of we get politicians setting policy rather than loose cannon setting policy. If you're like, I don't know, a very regional leader that only has to appeal to 10% of the population, or if you're a very extreme newspaper, then you don't actually have very much of an incentive to care about what your government has to do in terms of setting policy. But also you get a much more extreme and much more antagonistic version of policy, which I think is bad in general, and it's more likely to happen under your side of the house. I'm proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the first speaker for the campaign.
I'm going to start my speech by explaining why opening opposition gets the fourth in this round. In the first speech, they tell you, look, we need to have this national identity so that we can unite against Russia. We need this national identity so that we don't have Ukraine getting invaded. But then in the second speaker, they say, actually, this doesn't affect elections of anti-Russian demagogues because people have felt the plague and they will still feel this identity regardless. Which is it? Is it the case that all the harm of the proposition will not go away because that recent exposure means that the culture won't change at all? Or is it your claim that the culture will change and therefore you won't get any of the benefits of having proper engagement with Russia? This is a contradiction which actually destroys the entire opposition bench itself. I don't think I need to go into much rebuttal, but I'm going to do some at the very end. I'm going to start off with my extension. So, I'm going to do two things at the top of this extension. First of all, I'm going to explain why our comparative identity is likely and not just asserted under fiat like opening government did. So, I have 4 different reasons as to why you're likely to have identity, which is based on things like shared culture, shared dishes, shared traditions, shared language, and shared natural scenery or other iconic monuments within your country. The first reason that I want to point out is that there's no incentive to actually invent a new narrative against other countries and states which are nearby because you already have a positive relationship with them. Their argument assumes that you start from a relatively neutral position where you can all of a sudden invent the idea that Estonians should hate Latvians. But that's untrue. You're already united with them under the status quo, and it's very difficult to undo that narrative which has already occurred through the unification that they identified on their side of the house. No, thank you. Second of all, as they identify, identity is based on viscerality in time. The fact that many of these conflicts are far more removed means that the average person does not resonate with these kinds of events and wars which happened 80 years ago, which means that they're unlikely to use that as the peg for the way in which they're going to build their identity. The third thing that I want to point out is that you can't actually fully invent these kinds of identities because they oftentimes have to be leveraged by political leaders, but they can't be invented out of nowhere by these political leaders. So my question is, how does this naturally and organically spring up? No mechanism given by them as to an illustration or example of why this is likely to happen or how it plays out in the real world. The fourth and final reason why our comparative is more likely is because it's significantly easier for new people who weren't involved with that war to identify with things like the natural beauty of that country or things like the language and culture which they're immersed in on a day-to-day basis compared to a Russian struggle which their family never went through. So given that there's immigration in these countries, given that there are new influxes of people, our culture is more likely to have a hold on these people which changes the national fabric. So our comparative is likely, not just asserted. Second thing I'm going to prove in this extension. Why is it that national history and national iconography actually changes political culture? Because these guys and these guys kind of just assert it and assume that's true, but I'm going to walk you through the wings here. I think the important thing to note here is that visceral iconography, which is used, is actually extremely compelling. The reason why is because political leaders and individuals can play off recent history in specific ways that are able to compel individuals. Let me give you some examples. They play on things like biased language. They use extremely impactful and powerful language. They use pictures which are available for these recent events that are able to display the horrors that actually occurred. They gave a skewed perspective of history where they identify many of the problems, the things that people can immediately identify with, aka they see that the communist struggle as the main cause for the poverty, even though there are structural underlying reasons why their economy might be failing. So politicians, no thank you, are easily able to peg their identity and the way that their country moves based on the things that happened in the recent past. This influences political culture because this allows these individuals to say that current problems which exist primarily occur because of these issues that are recent, even if it doesn't acknowledge the present reality of the problems that exist. This leads to my explanation as to why there's going to be worse policy. And I'm going to tell you why this worst policy is domestic and actually affects all countries rather than just some of the countries as opening government tells you about. I think there are two problems. First, this allows for the creation of kleptocracy. When you look at countries like India or South Africa with the ANC, they oftentimes leverage this narrative of being the revolutionary leaders or the ones who care about the people who are suffering in order to leverage and show up support rather than using actual policies. That is to say, they plan a very specific type of identity politics, which is based on revolution rather than based on making changes in the present day. What this means is that you're able to win multiple elections again and again by using a visceral language that you are able to tie your politics towards. This means that you get lazy corrupt politics because once you've won 10 elections, that means that you don't think you need to create significant policy changes. It means that you start having gradual institutional entrenchment, no thank you, where you put your brother or sister in the judiciary, and where you start paying off bureaucrats to ensure that you're able to maintain their support to give political lobbying and favoritism. So, unlike what OO says, this is value positive. The value positive norm, I'll take in a moment, is anti-Russia, and your policies are built around that. That allows for the veneer of legitimacy, which allows you to establish kleptocracy. Opening.
The presumptive nationalisms that exist in these countries, the ones developed during like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where different countries were vying with each other for prominence within those empires, doesn't that mean that these nationalisms presumptively are likely to be in opposition to other ethnic groups in the region?
Okay, I gave you 4 reasons as to why that's not the likely type of national identity which is going to be used at the beginning of my speech, so perhaps you should listen. Okay, second thing that I think is going to happen, soundbite politics. Even if you don't have a kleptocracy which is created, in the process of campaigning, your primary campaigning strategy is to say, look, this policy isn't important because we're fighting against Russia. You're less likely to look at things, for instance, as fixing corruption, like we see in Romania, where corruption is constantly under the table because of issues about Russian identity and trying to fight against it. And you're not going to talk about better economic policies or changing domestic policies because you can use this as a diversion tactic within your election. It also means that parliamentarians within parliament only talk about these issues rather than talk about the stark and compelling issues at hand. The impact is that serious domestic problems aren't solved. Our comparative is simple. Even if it's not perfect, we get incremental change. Even if we buy open opposition's claim that this doesn't change political culture immediately, at least it happens in the long run by abandoning this, where we can start incrementally making these institutions less corrupt and talk about real policies, making the likelihood larger. How does this win the round? This beats government's arguments because their countries are reliant on the fact that some countries need Russian cooperation, or it's reliant on there being small portions of Russians within these countries. Our policy affects every single individual country in terms of getting better policy and affects every citizen of those countries. All the arguments are about the fact that there's a lack of value neutrality and corruption, and alternatively that this doesn't get rid of those different ideologies. We've already explained why that's unlikely. Brief rebuttal. 2 claims that we get from them that we need to unite against Russia. I've already dealt with this. I told you that you don't need this incentive if you're already at war with them and that you have significant numbers to incentivize action against them. They say that this also can include Russians, but our point is that even if it does, it's outweighed by changing domestic politics and ruining the ability to make strident changes. Very proud to propose on this basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I can call upon the third speaker for the opposition. Thank you.
I think we need to clarify at the beginning of the debate who are the different actors we're talking about. So first of all, notice that countries from the Caucasus, the Stans, Belarus, and so on are not in the debate because they never historically went against Russia, and right now their interests are aligned with Russia. So this might be the case that OG wanted, but they are not in the debate because they don't have this end-time narrative. What are the countries we're talking about? 2 groups. One is Georgia and Ukraine, out of the EU, but currently in war with Russia. Their own people don't want to be aligned with Russia. The reason why the war started in Ukraine was because Ukraine wanted to go with more liberal economical policies with the EU and sign the deal with them and not with the Russians, something that instigated riots there. The third group is the Baltics, Poland, and Hungary. Those countries have 30 years of tradition of democracy already, and those are within the EU and don't have Russian minorities with them. Once again, the case of OG is not that relevant towards them. Maybe only in the Baltics, but notice that in the Baltics they're also very anti-Russian. That's why they block all media channels coming from Russia, because they are afraid of being taken over by them. What does this tell us? First of all, this tells us that the metric for this debate is not necessarily bloodshed, even though we don't think that it would come to that. Why? Because people have more when they appreciate their identity. There is a reason why Britain did not succumb to Hitler, even though they might have gone out without having any blood spilled, because the Brits realized that there is something more important about their identity as a nation rather than being with the enemy and not having anyone go to war. We think that already we have strong indications in all of those countries that they prefer that even at the cost of. And never do we get a reason as to why the metric should be otherwise. Secondly, we agree about the fact that iconography matters. The question is, what are the alternatives and what do people want and what would this bring about? And also about this whole, their whole case about their new identity that would be formed and so on. Notice that there is a huge logical link between I don't go against the Russians and I become nationalist and I start stealing money. Also, notice that I can be as ethnical nationalist as the other side wants, because what are the alternatives for those people? Even if this new made-up identity would be created, it would revolve either some sort of primordial ethnical identity of tribes, of the Magyars and so on. This tends to be extremely nationalistic. Notice that this is being used currently to be anti-democratic and anti-EU, saying that there is something extremely unique about the Hungarian people, and that is why they are not a part of the EU, because they are different tribally. The second form of alternative that can be devised is the religious one, saying we are Catholics. We have something that makes us together because of the religion. We say that this is also extremely problematic because this creates corruption between the government and the religion. And this is something that also excludes all other minorities that are more prevalent here, like Jewish people or the Roma people and so on, something that does exist in those Western places. And this can also lead to the hatred of Russians, because Russians are not the majority of people living there. So we get all of the dangers coming from their side on the alternatives. But what do we say further? We say that beside the fact that they don't want to, we say that this is also something that is bad for them, aligning with Russia. Why is that? So we say that for the countries that are not in the EU, aligning with Russia might stop a war, but would erase them as a people. Why? Because Russia has objective interest in those places that go against the places of the people. They want to extract resources from the ports that don't freeze in the Black Sea. They want to take the good land of Ukraine, which is much better for harvesting than the land of Russia. And notice that the way Russia historically did it and continues on doing it in all of their proxy states is by having a puppet regime there that would allow them to put Russian companies in those places to take out all of the resources, channel the money back into Russia, and just pay off the ruler and the cronies of that ruler. And why does Russia have an interest? Because it's much easier to negotiate and only blackmail a small group of people, unlike an entire nation under a democracy that needs to be pleased. That's why we see in Chechnya. That is why Kadyrov is a very rich man that gets to have his own projects, but the Chechen people suffer a lot under his regime. We say that Georgia and Ukraine do not have such interest and would rather be with the West, supporting them, something that we already see more and more coming towards. But before I go on to the second part, I'll take closing? No.
So I gave you material at the end of my speech that established that these adversarial existential threat narratives justify the sort of autocracy and reduction in civil liberties that result in the availability of things like corruption or ruined civil society. Can you please respond?
No, we say that actually on our side there are more chances of that, and this leads me to my analysis. Why? Because we say that only if you have an anti-Russian narrative, you are more likely to see Russia as the enemy in all senses. Because if you remember that the communist regime was bad for you, you are more likely to opt into any other form of rule that is not that. You are more likely to think that what you became as a state, Europe, with functioning democracies and functioning institutions, with liberal economies, is what you want. We say that this is especially important in the time of Euroscepticism in those EU countries that relies on the primordial idea. We say that we need to constantly remind them that they were anti-Russian, anti-everything that is outside of the EU, and that there is something much worse coming if they don't look forward to it. And that they only became better states after the Russian period, meaning that only by seeing that you need to let go of Russia, you realize that what you have is much better than the alternative. Moreover, it allows people to think critically when they see Russian propaganda against the EU. Now, we're not saying that it's perfect, but we say that there are more chances of that happening if they know that Russia is the enemy and that they don't like Russia and their forefathers or grandfathers didn't like Russia. That's why if they see Russia doing something aggressive, they are more likely to not say we're letting go, but to say that we should hold on to our values because they are under threat. And for all of those reasons, we're very proud to
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the government.
Two questions for the House. First, what role does national identity play? Second, what kind of identity do we create for ourselves? First, what role does national identity play? I want to first rebuild some of the stuff Jason brought to the table, because unfortunately we received very little, if no response coming out from member opposition. The idea that Jason brought is fairly simple. If you have an identity of unification, which only singular parties, singular groups can lay claim to, as we see currently already in India, South Africa, Zimbabwe, what we have is people campaigning solely on their identity. And because they're the only ones who can legitimately lay claim to their identity, power is centralized in those individuals. This leads to the harms of kleptocracy and it hurts policy development. More on that in just a minute. Important thing to note here, this is distinct from what OG brought to the table. We'll be charitable to them. OG says two things that kind of relate to this vaguely. Don't try to let them use a POI to say that they took our extension, just as a true if you've been tracking, which I'm sure you have. The first thing they said was there's less faith in civil institutions. And an important link here they drew is that this means that there's less faith in the media. They spend about 30 seconds of it. He gives them the benefit of the doubt. It just isn't what our case is anyway. Our case for political parties and their interaction. The second thing they said is that politics is detoxified. Now don't let the term misguide you. What we're really saying is that politics will be more open to Russia. Quite distinct outcomes that we propose on our side. What were the two outcomes that we mentioned? First, kleptocracy and corruption. And this talked about, the stuff that I've already mentioned, right? When you leverage your own revolution, leverage your own path, you create a veneer of legitimacy that allows you to become corrupt. Now the important thing is that this is built on over time. That you create patronage networks because of that kind of legitimacy. Which means, even as you move more and more away from the time of the conflict, even as it becomes more and more distant and therefore people might not therefore lend you that legitimacy because the conflict was so long away, you build a patronage networks over time so that you create the corruption even into the future. I.e., you entrench corruption within the system of democracy, within that's bad, changing the national identity allows for changing that. Why? Because, wait a minute, whatever kind of alternative, and they haven't really been very clear what the counterfactual is on their side either, even if we have to accept the worst case of race-based politics, we still think that can deconstruct corruption insofar as different individuals can lay claim that in different race-based policies or race-based parties. So that deconstruction, even in the worst case, still falls to our side, reducing corruption. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time before I talk about how policy development, responding to the extension coming out from closing opposition. I think the idea behind the extension, or the fact behind the extension, might be correct. I can accept it is plausibly true that anti-Russian policies are writ large good across Eastern Europe. The problem is that there isn't a point for this motion. The point is that argument is fundamentally undemocratic. It's saying that here are some good policies. We should craft national identities such that you only select those good policies. One, I don't think they can describe what these good policies are, but two, more importantly, I don't think that's the way to go about doing it. Surely those policies are eminently reasonable. Then by system of democracy where we don't have only a singular group of individuals laying claim to those policies, we can can have a recent debate about it, which is why we talk about holistic policy development. No, thank you, both of you. Saying that we should develop national identities such that we will result in these policies just isn't democratic, and also is terrible if in the future pro-Russian policies turn out to be good. And I think we can conceptualize the future insofar as real politics always changes every day. If you craft national identity only to suit certain policies that are good now, that just isn't good for democracy in the long term, we think that is already out of this plane. Second, how does hurts policy development and further response to the stuff that already came out coming out from closing opposition? Now, I think Jason brought a lot to the table with no response on their side. The reason this hurts policy development is essentially you have a go-to battering ram as a response, even if it really isn't a direct response, right? As we know, it's called bad debating, but a lot of people might not be able to tell that when it comes to political election. In Estonia, for example, the Social Democratic Party has eminently very reasonable policies, but they're always shut down by the Reform Party and the Centre Party, who just says, but they are communists, and no one votes for them because they associate that with the anti-Russia sentiment, which opposition believes is also good. Similarly, economic policy discussions in the Hungarian parliament are always stopped by nationalist discussions from Fidesz or the Fidesz coalition, because they can simply say, look, why are you talking about economic policies? Do you not care about the looming Russian threat? They're most time away from important policy discussions that would essentially the development of these nations, especially because all of them might not be in a superior state of development as we might have come from countries which are. Now, the importance of this is not just that it hurts policy development and therefore stalls development, but it also cements the harms that OG brings to the table. They might talk about discrimination in terms of identity, but we cannot hold this discrimination is institutionalized insofar as it cannot wrangle power away from existing political powers or dominant political forces. I'll give opening a chance.
Even if individual leaders are associated with revolution, after their death, the successors are held to account. That isn't the case with the prescriptive national identities that leaders have the incentive to put in place, which enable certain ideologies to dominate indefinitely.
That's bullshit. In India, the leaders have died, and yet the parties are still in power. That's also true in countries like South Africa and Zimbabwe, because the party is associated with the leader, and the party claims that same legitimacy. Also, I discussed how during the times of the leader, corruption networks are created, patronage networks are created, whereby we can create a change on outside, you can't. I.e., even if the leader dies, and it is true, people don't like the party, they still have to suck it up because the corruption already is in place, which is why you're defending on your side the continuity of that corruption. That's just a waste of POI. But thank you. Second, what kind of identity do we create, given that we talked about how we already institutionalized the harms coming up from government as a whole? The kind of identity could we create, and Jason spent a long time talking about this, very disappointingly little responses, 4 reasons why we create a kind of universal identity. But we talk about how you're already unified with others, how the revolution is distant, how you cannot just randomly reinvent identities, how there need people, so this kind of unified, fluctuating identity is something that's always very good when in countries which face high migration rates as we do in Eastern Europe. The only response we heard coming out, I think both from OG and CG, OG primarily in POI, is that there were past conflicts, and the Anglo-Hungarian conflict, and therefore it must be the case that identities are built upon these past conflicts. The trouble is that while we can assess the impacts of developing an identity that is primarily against the Russian struggle, retrospectively, this debate is for us to prescribe a certain policy into the future. I.e., given that this is the state that we are now, this is not a prefers a world whereby we didn't have this kind of national identity, given that we are already living in a world where we have achieved some unification across different peoples, the national identity that's likely to develop from this premise is one that recognizes that unification, stuff Jason talked about, but no response from their side. Now, importantly, this is actually feasible. Countries like Mexico, Nicaragua, Mozambique all have revolutions, but none of them develop their identity on the basis of those revolutionary struggles. I.e., they cannot simply claim that there were past divisions and it's the only way we achieve unification. What is the outcome of this that is important? We can create, and it's more likely to create a unified culture on our side that no one has or can lay sole claim over. That means different political parties can then lay claim over this culture, try to wrangle what the best policy development for the future is. We reduce corruption, we improve countries as a whole, stand firmly in closing down.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the final speaker for the opposition.
So this was a bit of a mess, and frankly, I blame every team that isn't us. Because they all tried to put all of those same countries, which we mine was conveniently grouped into 3 categories which actually have traits in common, into one single category and apply the same analytical tools to all of them and imagine that they all work, which just on the grounds of plausibility, every average informed global citizen should know is highly implausible, right? So we'll try to address, just like in refutation, the sort of claims that they made before delving into each of the scenarios and then explain why our specific claims are true and their generic claims don't translate well into that scenario. So, first of all, about this idea that we get from closing. The idea from closing, to put it in an analogy, is like saying, listen, only one party in Israel would be able to co-opt the anti-Holocaust narrative, at which point they would become dominant in Israeli politics to the point where they can't be overthrown. That's the first premise they never analyzed and never showed, that only one party can be anti-Russian. That is firstly untrue because of no analytical reason why only one party can be anti-Russian. Secondly, every party has the incentive to be anti-Russian. Thirdly, just reality, right? All parties in Estonia, except the one Russian minority party, are basically anti-Russian, right? That's how they get votes, by not taking an unpopular position. So there's just no exclusivity of that, at which point the harms of kleptocracy and autocracy don't happen because parties can actually compete. Second premise is that there won't be any exclusivity of the new narrative. We don't see particularly why that's the case, especially when we speak about a narrative that's so artificially manufactured. It seems that exactly the party which manufactures it can manufacture exclusivity for it. And we are the only ones who stood to protect the beauty and strength of Ukraine in this changing environment in the post-Russian area. Just be exclusive about that, right? Thirdly, just the idea that they can just ignore any other alternative narrative in the past, which is to say, if a party tries to make this new beautiful Ukraine sort of PR campaign narrative, they'll be beat by a party which, even if it's not like the anti-Russian narrative, which is fiated, says, listen, this is the Christian Orthodox narrative of Ukraine, or this is the Magyar narrative of Hungary. Just the ones claiming the narratives that are sectarian and are individualistic will be significantly more appealing than this manufactured ad for like being a tourist in Ukraine or something like that. So, done with C. Now, to this idea of Russian minorities, I'm getting to you, don't worry. So, so the idea is this. Because of the narrative, people will hate Russians, and therefore they'll disenfranchise them in various ways. To this, we have a couple of objections in the short term, but before we get to them, please note our long-term objection to this. In the long term, adopting a pro-Russian strategy, as OG concede will happen, so therefore CG can't try to frame it out of the debate, as OG concede will happen, right? A normalization with Russia. They tap on the table vehemently when we say no more blocking of Russian TV channels. They tap on the table vehemently when we hear more conversation with Russian officials and letting them in on TV. Therefore, this introduction of Russian propaganda and Russian messages into the population triggers an ability of the Russians to effectively export their governmental preferences. Unfortunately, even though OG are not realists and don't think politics is a trade-off in which one side wins and one side loses, Putin does, which is exactly why he expresses his anti-democratic preference in every country in which RT can access, or in which Sputnik can access, in which Russian media can access. Exactly, Monica mechanizes to you how these can happen in 2 significant ways. One, by controlling the media which these people consume, and secondly, by controlling the political parties they can actually vote for, because now they can finance parties within that environment, which, because of like the narrative change facilitated by OG, now have big room in the political stage and control them internally using corrupt money that they fund to their people and enact this puppet regime that they so want, which means in the long term, everybody gets disenfranchised, right? Because the Russian minority is not doing so well, but I venture to say that in many respects they are doing well, firstly than the Chechen minority in Russia, but also than the Russian majority in Russia in very many respects. They're in a country with better GDP, a better economy, better individual rights, less human rights violation, doing better than the Russian majority in Russia in very many respects. So in the long term, we win big time. In the short term, firstly, we don't accept like this copying of Western narratives that minorities immediately matter. These are not the Muslims of London, the Russians of Estonia. They are not intrinsically more important than the Estonians of Estonia. We could say they got screwed over actually less over the last 100 years than the Estonians of Estonia. And since they are less people, we don't think they should necessarily be prioritized above the Estonians of Estonia. Secondly, as we point out helpfully in NPY, now just flatly irrelevant in half the countries in the debate. Thirdly, and thirdly, just like look at Belarus, right, as an example of these cases in which those policies were adopted, and ask yourself, were even the Russians of Belarus better enfranchised, or did we actually get a puppet autocracy which disenfranchises everybody equally? Which is nice, but not very helpful. Closing.
Okay. Not only does your response to our extension depend only on circumstances where there weren't leaders who were tied to these parties who did overthrow Russia, but it also misses the part where even if there are multiple anti-Russian parties, they won't talk about the policy issue still. They'll still jostle about Russia, ignoring the second half of our
That's to a large
extension.
extent. Listen, just fact, right? The Polish party, the Justice and Law Party, is just new, unrelated to whoever overthrew Russia, which is, like, by the way, just like the Allied forces, right? In Orban, unrelated completely. Estonia, unrelated completely. Just, it's imaginary, right? It maybe exists in one country, but they don't know these facts, I promise you. So, about Euros, just like conveniently, right? About Euroscepticism, we say declining this narrative of pro-Russianism comes along with a few convenient corollaries and intuitive associations. I deny these things which say communism was good, so I also deny state surveillance, which they are worried about. I also deny over bureaucratizing. I also deny centralization and autocracy. I denounce all these things and therefore become closer to the European Union, and other parties who oppose me can weaponize those sorts of narratives of you are acting like the Soviets in order to overthrow me if I overstep my boundaries. On the converse, if we get closer to Russia, since getting closer to Russia, as again we point out in the helpful POI, is mutually exclusive to staying in the European Union, which actually sanctions them, getting closer to Russia, which OG concedes, means Euroscepticism. We say that's bad for those countries in terms of freedom, in terms of exercising the will of the people, and in terms of having a liberal economy that actually works in every single way. And when we talk about, and just like for the interest, they've tried to like, OG has basically propped RT's rationalization of why Putin invades Russia, right? To protect the Russian people and because the Ukrainians are acting crazy. Monica suggested a significantly more logical analysis that Putin actually needs a warm water port in the Black Sea so that Russia is not landlocked to the south. That Putin actually needs territorial access to Kaliningrad so he is not locked out in the north. And he just has Russian television to enable him to tell whichever lies he wants. He'll just tell different lies, but they'll still be effective. Thanks.
Very much. Let's speak by this is fact. This is yours is an RT stance, ours is a different stance. It actually became very difficult to try and weigh up these against each other because I think all of these are partially true and partially not true. Natural adjudication, there's a tendency to over-determine and over-explain a result, when in reality there are multiple ways of calling this debate. I'll give you the one we did, I'll come with a consistent explanation, but there are others as well. So in the end, very narrowly, the winner went to opening government, the second to closing government, the third to closing opposition, and the fourth to opening opposition. Let's start with the top half, and why opening government beat opening opposition. So from opening government, we hear two fairly clear arguments. One is that Russian minorities end up being hurt, and secondly is antagonism from Russia and towards Russia decreases. The two reasons for this is one, a characterization of why Russia acts, which is Russia is trying to protect, Putin is trying to protect Russian-speaking populations. That's important as the debate goes on, though wasn't necessarily analytically defined from opening government. And secondly, this makes it more plausible to have a reasonable political debate, albeit mainly about Russia in their countries. There's obviously other material as well, but that's what we get from opening government. Why does that beat what we get from opening opposition? So I think, firstly, it's worth looking at opening opposition's response to this Russian minority claim, which is threefold. I think the ones which are not overly effective is you know that Russian minorities often have done well in the past, which is probably true, but I don't think you note that that is still true now, so it does seem like a group will ignore for that reason. Secondly, while you note that it is plausible that you can have an ethnic narrative of an anti-Soviet struggle which is not anti-Russian, it is worth noting that opening government's characterization and arguments about this involve that what we have got is a demonization and strong demagogues and populists rising, so it seems less likely that you will get that positive outcome. The third response you have, which I think is the one which continues throughout this debate, is even to the degree this group is harmed, and in some countries they are not necessarily the most important group in this debate, which we think is fair, but it is worth then noting to some degree in this debate that harm still stands. So the question is then, what are you outweighing it with? When it comes to the notion of Russian aggression, what you note is, no, Russian nationalism is much more extensive than that. Russia thinks it's a great loss to lose Kiev. That is plausible, but I don't actually know how to weigh up these two claims of what exactly Russia wants against each other. So I think in a sense that can partially negate the claim, but doesn't necessarily get very far. So the question is then, what else do you have to outweigh? So the main claim you then make is that the creation of identity might well be damaging, because what it will be is these nations, or Baltic nations for instance, fighting against each other, or history of that kind of fight, and that is particularly bad because we want them to cooperate with each other. So a lot of this debate comes down to what we actually believe this counterfactual is, or to what degree we believe the proposition has fiat here. I think the conclusion we reached on this is it is fair for the opposition to note that there can be other national identities or other identities, but you need to do a little bit more to establish the probability of those. In particular, I think even if we are to believe the claim from opening opposition, which is that you will talk about war and that might in some way harm cooperation, the response from opening government is even when you do think about war between Latvia, Lithuania, or Sweden or something, that still doesn't necessarily prevent cooperation, as in the case of the EU. So it isn't entirely clear that this is the narrative which was created instead. I think it's a plausible assertion, but I don't know if it's more plausible on their side, and why that would make cooperation plausible or impossible isn't fully made, nor is the claim as to why exactly that cooperation is so vital, even though I think you start pushing in the direction, we talk about things like collective action problems as potentially ways of doing it, I think that's a little bit underdefined. So as arguments, these are all reasonably well made, they're all reasonably consistent, but I think the reason why you don't do enough to show that this is the likely counterfactual or counter-narrative, and why that is likely to definitely break relations, or the other side of that is, do you need to be very strongly unified in the practical claims the other side will make? So I don't think that argument quite works as effectively as it could. And I think in addition to that, the stuff about identities and how they'll be pushed instead is actually very clever. The problem is, I don't know what the outcome of that is, or the comparative outcome. So if you are to believe that instead sub-regional groups or other political parties push these identities, is that worse than the status quo? You do know it could be more extreme. The response we get, both in the speeches and in open information, is, but they're already pretty extreme, it's the demagogues pushing it. And then you say it can be more extreme. Well, what does that look like? And more importantly, then the comparative is a slightly more extreme narrative, but perhaps less powerful because it's on the state level. And why is that more damaging, which I don't think you're quite then able to prove. So I think all these arguments are good. I don't think they fully respond to what we get from opening government, and partly because it's just how we have to think about how the narrative works, which is why then you lose to opening government. Closing government. So closing government have 4 editions. I think one of them isn't particularly additive, which is the stuff about like political culture and how that changes, how changes are made. I think there are more words attached, but that is broadly what is strongly implicit times explicit in opening government. So the 3 additions you then bring to this debate are a better explanation as to why the identity suggested by opening government is likely to be the case, which is there are already these positive relations between neighbors, and as a result it probably won't be that identity, which is useful. I guess as an analytic addition, it actually doesn't get you to a very different conclusion in opening government, but that's fine. Then that you'll already use the kinds of narratives which exist and the kinds of identities which exist. I do think what that does is make the claims of opening government as to what the identity would be a little bit more plausible, even if I don't think they are utterly implausible for opening gov, but I do think that is a useful addition. Secondly, the stuff about kleptocracy. We really struggle with the context of this debate for 2 reasons. I think it is very well argued from factual premises which are asserted, they are counter-asserted. And the counter-assertion is undoubtedly more true than the assertion. But the counter-assertion just kind of becomes, here is an example of Poland, and they don't know things. I think, in a sense, it's not that we aren't going to give the argument any kind of credit at all, but I don't think it gets a huge amount of credit, because what it's based on is that a political party dominates this, and they are able to note that that quite possibly, in many cases, isn't true. I don't think the response we get from opening up to that, to be fair, is quite deals with the analysis they did, which wasn't just about a leader or an individual party. It's how you control institutions, which I think we get cleanly enough both in the extension speech and to some degree the summary speech. So I don't think that response worked very well. So there's some credit we give you to that argument. The third claim you make is perhaps the most powerful one in the context of this debate, which is what you now end up with is this soundbite politics, which is an odd term to use, but it is that now Russia dominates what everyone talks about. So anything domestically becomes less important because of the notion of fighting against Russia, and that becomes the dominant issue in all politics, so you don't get any kind of movement or any kind of real improvement in these countries, which is reasonable as an addition to what we get, and perhaps I think in the context of what we're getting, a strong addition. It is unclear whether these all together defeat what we get from opening government, but I'll come back to that in a moment.
Okay.
Then let's talk about closing opposition. Also created a problem in the context of this debate. So you note that there are 3 different groups of countries involved. The stuff about this stands fair enough, as if they aren't really in this debate. I mean, fine. The claim that there are countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and the Baltics, which may be affected by Russian nationalism, but aren't the entire majority of countries, also fine. Though I think in those countries, I guess opening government's claims do apply, but you can easily then outweigh them. Then you have your claims about Poland and Hungary as potential other countries which we need to consider in the context of this debate. So it is a useful way of splitting up the debate. The question then is what do you do with that split up? So then there's 2 arguments which you forward. The first is, here are other kinds of identities which could be created. This could be, for instance, based on religious identity or tribal identities. Now, the importance of that argument is much more against closing government than it is against opening government. And the reason I think this is the case is it is not obvious why these identities will be the ones which are going to be used, except for the fact that in the way in which closing government speaks about identities, that you need pre-existing identities, things which are already there, in many ways, as they note, the identities they're talking about seem to fit into that category. So it seems entirely plausible then that if that is the case, some of the exclusion, which you're trying to bypass, is now back in the debate because they give you plausible identities which meet the criteria which you suggested for what kind of narratives would be created which are going to be used. It is unclear to me that absent those additions from closing government that you actually do a great deal to show that these will be institutionalized, but I do think that is a useful addition on top of what we've heard thus far. Then we have the material which is harder to assess, which is the claim about how Russia acts and why this is so damaging, which goes as follows, which is Russia does not care about Russian-speaking populations, but is doing this for strategic reasons. And you note 3 potential options, which is they may want land in Ukraine, they may want their ports, and they potentially want all the land to Kaliningrad. I think it's a little bit underdeveloped as to why any of this really matters, and why this is the things which should matter the most to Russia. I think in a sense, that's a little bit assertive, but even to the degree that is true, what then follows from that analytically is what this policy entails is that the people of these countries will no longer assess that to be their interests and will instead think of other things because of the strength of Russian propaganda and that coming across. I think the difficulty with us believing that, firstly vis-a-vis opening government, is I think you take an incredibly non-generous view of what they are saying, that they want Russian media in. I don't know from that you can go, Russian media will control everything, or you will end up with puppet governments. I think it's an analytic jump in that case. So even if I believe that Russian influence in many cases is damaging, I'm not sure you actually explain why Russia then ends up with control of everything, or why Russia has so much influence beyond a suggestion for opening government. And it's worth noting even that opening government don't seem to suggest that you are eliminating antagonism towards Russia. They still think that you're going to have Western intervention, or the potential support from the United States. So I'm not sure you do enough to go that now Russia will be able to create puppet governments in those places, and then people will be able to serve their interests. But second, in some ways, as closing opposite government point out, that then becomes, it falls into the problem you yourself suggested. There's these different groups of countries where some of them Russian influence may well be good. Partly opening government was talking about those, but closing government will also note in that context that what we end up with is there are going to be places where we don't want to prejudge the debate as to what is actually good or not good for these countries. So at that point I thought the second part of your extension is one which, while at times reasonable, is one you would then lose to both governmentees. So where then does that leave us, which is then a slightly difficult position we were in. I think then the conclusion we came to is this threefold, obviously. So first in terms of the Gov bench, I think then what we got in terms of the soundbite politics stuff, potentially quite interesting, but perhaps you don't go far enough in terms of explaining why that thing matters the most, and almost, I think, explicitly spend so much time on this kleptocracy claim, which I think you need to explain more the premises as more plausible, which are underlying it. The consequence of that is, while we accept that Russian minorities may not be the most important minority in this debate, and not all countries will necessarily want better relations with Russia, it does seem to be a more concrete harm, whether it's larger or smaller, we're a little bit agnostic about, but I don't think you do any work to make that seem to be more powerful than what we get. So narrowly then, we were thinking that opening government will beat closing government. When it then comes to the diagonal of opening government and closing opposition, I think in a sense the same kind of logic applies, which is while we think that there are these potential identities, these identities can be exclusionary, the reasons you don't do enough to show that these are going to be the identities exist, other than to the degree you are implicitly piggybacking of closing government, which I don't think we can fault opening government for. So that as being the strongest addition you make, which I think you perhaps need to do a bit more impacting for, though arguably not really, but I think you probably still do, because they spend a lot of time explaining why the situation for Russian minorities is so bad. It's not obviously the situation for all religious or tribal minorities is that bad, but clearly is, which is kind of the difficulty for us there. So we didn't think that part of the argument was then going to beat opening government. So in a sense, it's not charitable to put it this way, because it was good, but almost by then, opening government has beaten these two teams very narrowly by a default of people not responding quite enough to you and piggybacking of later analysis rather than earlier analysis. Then when discussing the back half, I mean, in a sense, we're somewhat stuck in terms of what we do in terms of these two claims, which is there will be exclusion of some of these minorities in some of these cases, but we end up with this politics which could well harm large groups, which could help harm the political impact in many of these countries. The closest we get, I think, to weighing these is a claim that this soundbite politics affects all. You give some examples of this, but your examples just seem to be that you can name political parties in Hungary rather than real examples of this. But I think in a sense, that is a little bit more weighed up than what we get from closing opposition. There is, of course, and we're not satisfied with that kind of being the way in which that needs to be done, but I think both sides took out much of the material from the other bits, so we're left with fairly small amounts to compare against each other. And I think they do a little bit more, literally 2 lines more, to weigh up why what is remaining standing should matter a reasonable amount, and as a result we very narrowly gave the second to closing government over closing opposition. Do you have anything to...
No.
It was not an easy debate to call, but hopefully that is at least consistent, even if not ultimately satisfied. It wasn't quickly for us either. But good luck in the next round.
Thank you.